So the latest edition, well, year 2024, the Player's Handbook, talks about like party roles, and they bring up that you could play the classic four roles: fighter, wizard, cleric, and rogue. And this kind of model goes back to the original Dungeons and Dragons. I'm most familiar with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. That was the earlier version that I played the most of. And these would be, in this edition, the fighter, the magic user, the cleric, and the thief. So, are these four roles still viable? Are they still clearly defined today? On one hand, yeah. In depending on your DM, a DM that's DMing well can make the game work for any of these roles, and you can have a game in which these roles work very well. And so, sure. But then, kind of another question is, but are these roles like distinct now? Are they like meaningful, distinct roles, clearly defined? And the answer is, as we'll see, probably not. So, the first classic role is the fighter. They're defined in terms of having good hit points. Today, current edition, they still have good hit points, but they've lost a bit of their edge because they have a D10, D12 for barbarians, and the other classes like wizard used to be a D4, now a D6. The rogue, D6 now a D8, and so their hit point edge over other classes is less. Armor was a big thing. In AD&D, fighters could wear the heaviest armor, and clerics could wear good armor too. But in the current version, it's if you go with like the 2014 edition, by picking a particular species or race or a feat or multiclassing, you could get heavy armor proficiency. Now, it may be saying, hey, but couldn't people multiclass back in the earlier games? And the answer is yeah, but for humans, you could only have two classes, dual class. And if you were like a fighter and you decided to switch to wizard, you'd go up as a fighter. And then if you wanted to go to wizard, you had to stop wearing armor. You had to stop fighting with weapons. You'd have to go and level up as a wizard or magic user until you exceeded your fighter level. Then you'd start gaining hit points again. And then you could, fight. But you could not wear armor because if you wore armor, you couldn't cast spells. So humans, fighter magic users, no casting in armor. Demi-humans, like elves and half-elves, could be fighter magic users. Also fighter magic user, thief, etc. And you could wear armor, so you could do it that way, but multiclassing was pretty punishing because it wasn't additive. It wasn't like if you were first level fighter, first level wizard, you had, the full hit points, and you divided the hit points. So first level fighter, first level wizard would have a D10 plus a D4 divided by 2. And so your hit points weren't great. You could wear armor, though, so that was good. Fighters are good at hitting things, and back in AD&D, they had the best chance to hit things based on level progression, and this held through second edition, third edition, 3.5, Pathfinder. But of course, now in the current version of D&D, everyone's basically equally good because everyone has the same proficiency bonus. So if you have a fighter with a proficiency bonus of +2 and a 13 ability score, they attack at +3 to hit. If you have a magic user or wizard, +2 proficiency, ability score of 13, they have the same +3 to hit. So equally good at hitting things. So fighters have lost that to other classes. Now this simplifies things. Instead of having like these different progressions, everyone progresses the same. But the fighters' kind of deal was they were good at hitting things, and now they're the same as everyone else. Another thing the fighter was good at in AD&D was multiple attacks. They had the weird fractional attacks and stuff then, but now fighters, they still get their multiple attacks, so that's good. But there's been a blurring between the classes because if you take, for example, like Hexblade, or you take a particular class of Bard, you can also get these multiple attacks. And, in a sense, the fighter kind of loses that special, doesn't lose a special thing, but they're no longer as special because other class, can do it and probably do it better because they'll have, spells and stuff. Now, another important feature of the fighter in early editions of D&D, especially AD&D, was, as I've always said, when I played, fighter classes, I never run out of stabbing. So you can run out of ammunition, etc., but you can always fight. And one reason why this is very important in AD&D was because the magic user, they didn't have cantrips in the original version, and so if you had a first level magic user in the party, they get one spell per day, and everything else was just like, throwing darts, or if they decided to go in with their dagger, they'd probably die. And so you had to rely on the fighter to do, the fighting, because that was their job. They never ran out of stabbing. Now, with the addition of things like cantrips, wizards, sorcerers, etc., they never run out of cantrips. So, in fact, cantrips are generally better than weapons in the current version. And so that role, never run out of stabbing, is kind of gone because the other classes never run out. They can always do stuff. Now, on the plus side, they can always do stuff. When I played a magic user in AD&D, I remember that was, you just kind of went along, in the back, throwing darts until you decided it was the chance to use that one spell that one time. So this is both an improvement, more for caster classes to do, but it also kind of takes the role of the fighter away, because instead of having to say, okay, we got to be really careful with our our resources. The fighter is going to handle the fighting. The magic user will be throwing darts. Everyone's blasting away, which again can be a plus because it can be more fun in that regard. But it does take the role of the fighter, the classic role, and that's kind of gone. Doing the fighting, so the wizard, magic user, and cleric can do their stuff when using the spells would be best. So the magic user. Now this would be like the wizard and sorcerer, etc. Those classes. Their hallmark, of course, was powerful spells. And of course, that's still true. They're still the caster classes are still powerful spellcasters. Unless again you're doing a multi-class, no armor at all. So you're just a person wearing clothing, running around in the dungeon. Now again, because of the way the new version works, you could have a wizard running around in full plate armor. They used to have the lowest hit points, still do, but that's improved. They were incredibly bad at fighting. They had the worst chance to hit because they were supposed to be wizarding. And now the exact same as everyone else. Again, fighters classes can get like more, combat-y stuff in their class, but a wizard, a magic user, and a fighter, same stats, same proficiency, same chance to hit. The magic user in the AD&D would run out of spells. You had no cantrips, and so you had to really, kind of allocate your resources carefully. Now, running out of spells is still a thing because you have slots, but the cantrips were a real great game changer. Well, on the one hand, good because you always have something to do. You can blast away the spell or do something, as opposed to like throwing darts. Again, the downside though is that fighters are way less important because you can just keep, as a magic user, you can blast away with your cantrips, and your cantrips are almost certainly, especially if you're like a warlock with Eldritch Blast, or you've gotten it through like one of the feats or something, then you'll be better than a fighter, and typically because you're doing force damage and you're getting, if at the right level, you're getting effectively multiple attack rolls. So the magic user, wizard, etc., still completely viable, still powerful, and so bits of being a caster is viable. In fact, it's probably the most viable, actually clearly the most viable role in the current game, what we used to call the arcane casters, but that's also been kind of blurred as well. The cleric, classic role. They have medium hit points, still the same, unchanged. D8 back then, D8 now. Good armor, and you can, depending on your subclass, etc., you can have the best armor. They were always been okay at hitting things. Under the new proficiency system, they're the same as everyone else. The classic clerics had turn undead. Now they still have the similar ability, but of course it's been improved a bit. Spells then, spells now. And their main role was healing. Of course they had other spells as well for you, just like now for buffing and debuffing. Healing, of course, is not as that important in the current edition of D&D. Healing word, really important, because if someone goes down, getting them back up as a bonus action, super useful. At the very least, the enemy has to waste an action, knocking them back down again. But healing, is not really like a primary thing in the current edition, because damage just so vastly outpaces healing. Aside from just getting someone up from 0, that healing is not a waste entirely, because at least you're doing something. It's better than doing nothing, except you're burning a spell slot, but it's not very effective, except in the case where you're using something like heal. Because if you're able to dump a ton of hit points into somebody, then it's going to take the enemy hopefully a long time to chew through that. So the cleric role is kind of viable, although really all you need now for like the cleric role is a caster who can do do the spells, and you need someone who can cast healing word. Bards can do that. Obviously all the cleric classes. Cleric's really good class, but the kind of classic cleric role doesn't really like exist anymore. You've kind of the deal now is every class is kind of like damage with a bit of a side hustle, maybe in support or utility, where you do like a healing word occasionally when someone goes down, or you cast like some debuffs or buffs. So kind of the classic, I am the cleric, I will turn undead, I will heal the party. I mean, you can still play that, but it's not really needed. All you really need, and you can maybe get by without this, is healing word. Lastly, we got the classic role of the thief. They have low hit points, although now they've been upgraded, to a D8, so they're as good as a cleric. Just like in the original edition, leather armor, so the light armor. And generally, if you're doing like sneaky stuff, you'd want to keep light armor. Back then, they had what was called what we call now sneak attack, and they called it backstab. You didn't have to be, you kind of had to be behind things. It was weirdly complicated. Now, the main thing about the thief in AD&D was it was the only class that actually had what we call skills. I mean, they didn't define it as like skills in terms of the current 5e, but it's the only class that actually had a table for doing things like climbing walls and picking locks, dealing with traps. And so the thief in much of AD&D was a pretty essential class, because if you went in the dungeon, you could do the traps by just like walking into them and just like absorbing the damage. That's an option if you have enough hit points. Clerics had the spell, find traps, which you could say, hey, there's some traps, but then you really didn't have a great way of dealing with them. So the thief was a really important class, because they're the ones that could sneak around, they could hear things, they could open the locks, they could, deal with the traps. And classic dungeon crawls often had a lot of traps. So what about today? Well, it's now the rogue, and the rogue has kind of like lost that, because they used to be, again, the only class with these abilities, and now every class, of course, can have skills. For example, in the campaign I'm running now, there's no rogue in the party. They haven't needed one, because they've got a bard who's got a bunch of skills. They've got a cleric with perception skill, because you can, based on your background or feats or etc., you can get everyone can get all the skills. And so finding traps is just a simple matter of having a good perception. You get a cleric, high wisdom, cast guidance, and boom, you've got really good perception. And in terms of dealing with the traps, you've got you just have a character with appropriate skill. You get your cleric, guidance, and boom. So the thief went from being the only class that could handle traps and pick locks, etc., an essential part of the party, to someone you don't need. You don't need them at all now, because other classes can do, just fine in finding and dealing with traps. And the 5th edition seems to be sort of thematically kind of, with some exceptions, kind of like a less trap-based approach. Traps don't seem to be as common. Although, of course, a DM could easily change that. I'm more of a classic DM, so I do throw in quite a bit of traps. So to conclude, on one hand, of course, the classes are still viable. If you wanted to run a game where, hey, we're going to be I'm going to be a fighter, you're going to be a wizard, you're going to be a cleric, and a thief. We're going to do the classic D&D. And that could totally work. You could have the DM set it up. So your fighter is fighting things, your magic user, your wizard is wizarding things, your cleric is doing cleric stuff, and your thief is, hopefully not stealing from the party and then getting justly, murdered by the party. They're doing like trap stuff. But in terms of the actual, roles, the being a wall between the roles, cleric roles, that's been blurred out by the ability to just kind of pick and choose among the classes. Multi-classing, ability for pretty much anyone to get any skills they want based on backgrounds, etc. That is sort of in all the different subclasses. So if you want something that like fights really well, doesn't, because it's all damage now, you could just go with probably like a hexblade, better than a fighter. Or if you just want to do, lots of damage and do like all kinds of stuff, wizard, and if you could just have your wizard wearing heavy armor, having a sword, just because, and just be blasting everything. You don't need any fighters. So the classes that probably got become like non-essential would be a fighter class, what they call now a martial, the thief class, non-essential, and the wizard class, basically caster is kind of this central thing. In the optimizing videos, people who do those make that pretty clear. Whenever they talk about optimization, it's always a class that can, with some very limited exceptions, it's always a class that can cast spells. And even the fighter classes now, the ones that are considered the best, are either have like kind of like strange abilities like the Echo Knight, or are some type of like caster thing, or they're like a combination. So the multi-classing also kind of took out these roles as well. So that's the classic roles in the context of 2024. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the dungeon in the future.